Hello and welcome to the Golfing Greenkeeper podcast, the episode today that follows the previous number 10. This is number 11. A quick overview of today's episode. We'll be walking the fairways or striding those fairways today, giving you the latest news of what's going on around the country and the golf courses of Australia and what's happening, looking at some big names opening up in Victoria. So there's a bit of news coming out of there, out of the state of Victoria. There's a lot of things that I'm finding out that's going on in New South Wales. And today I have a new segment called Aussie Golf History. And this one is about a man called Dan Soutar. Walking the fairways, 29th of November, 2020. As we set out in the sizzling, soon-to-be summer sun, beautiful Australian weather, we stride across the fairways, looking to see what's happening out in Australian golf courses at the moment. Starting out with Victoria. We love the Victorians. We love the courses down there. We have Sandringham, as I've got to keep referring to it by its new name of Sandy Links Golf Club, is open for business. The full 18 holes, a brand new redesign done by OCM, Ogilvy, Cocking and Mead. The group that is a wonderful design firm in Australia, have done so much work. We've all heard about them, I'm sure, no doubt, in lots of places. And Sandy Links is finally open for play. Only happened a couple of days ago. If you have been waiting for this, if you've been thinking about it, if you've had a momentary thought, just a little tiny speck of thought in your head about, I wonder whether I should go and play Sandy Links, yes, you should. That's what's happening. Yes, you should. You just need to get out there, book a time, call them, go online and make it happen. It is a brand new redesigned golf course of the old, on the same track, the old track that it was, but it's fully redone and it's going to be a lot of fun to play. This course looks fantastic from the air. It looks fantastic from the ground. It looked fantastic when I was down there looking at it being built. It is just going to be awesome. So make a point of getting down there if you're in Melbourne and going and playing golf. Have a lot of fun doing it. Sandy Links, welcome to the real world. Moving to another one that's opened up it hasn't opened up yet, but it is opening very, very soon, and that is Lonsdale Golf Club. Now that's down on the, let me get this right, the southwestern side of Melbourne, down the Geelong way. I don't know that side terribly well. Yet again, another OCM design, I should say, and build. This looks spectacular in a different way. This is the template hole golf course that I was talking about with the redans, with the punch bowls, with different template greens to play around on the golf course, things you might have heard in of other golf courses around the world, famous types of green structures and designs. This is going to be a lot of fun, interesting. There's some square cut greens and things like that happening out on course. You're going to see some really, really cool stuff. They have announced that from the 27th of December this year, they will be open to the public. Now that, if you want to give someone a Christmas present, by all means, this is the ticket to give them. They are going to love it, whether they can travel from New South Wales or other states, South Australia, Queensland, whatever. You're going to want to go and play Lonsdale. I want to go and play Lonsdale. Everyone wants to go and play Lonsdale. I've seen some of the Airswing media imagery coming out of Lonsdale that Nick Wall from Airswing's done is absolutely incredible. It's epic, you might say. This is the place to be. So in the new year, after Christmas, 2021, 2022, just get to Lonsdale. This is going to be unreal. And they've just got this magnificent clubhouse as well on top of it. So there's a lot of reasons to go down the western side around Port Phillip Bay, around from Melbourne down past Geelong to get to Lonsdale. You're going to love it. I'm telling you, it's just that good. Thank you for coming aboard Lonsdale and announcing your opening date. Heidelberg Golf Club. We're still in Victoria. We go to a little bit of a lesser named golf course in Heidelberg. And Heidelberg's it's not one of the big metros. It's a good golf course. That's what it is. Heidelberg's a great golf course. They're doing some work out there. And they've had an army of volunteers helping their staff out on course, doing a few upgrades. And I love doing a few upgrades to the course. And I love seeing volunteers helping out on course. I love it when there's passion that's directed in the right way. But Heidelberg have got an army of volunteers, as do a lot of golf clubs. We had them at Katoomba. I know plenty of courses do have them, and they are worth their weight in gold, honestly. And they've been helping out with these new stairs that are happening on some of the tee complexes, just to make it easy for people to get up and down the tees. Wonderful little addition to the golf course. It's always helpful. It's always good when they're brand new. They would have, just made life a lot easier in around these complexes. So they've done it on the 6th tee, 7th tee, 9th tee, 11th tee, 18th tee. It's a wonderful thing that some of the volunteers and the members are able to help out with, and it's a good addition to the golf course. So well done, Heidelberg, on using your army of volunteers very, very well and helping out on the golf course. That's fantastic. That's some of the stuff that's happening in Victoria. Going to move to New South Wales now, and there's quite a few things going on in New South Wales. Starting off with Blackheath Golf Club. Now, you might have seen that I've recently been up the Blue Mountains west of Sydney to Blackheath Golf Club to see the golf course that's just starting their stage one of a course rebuild. They're doing a few greens, be it the first green, the 16th green, and the 18th green, first tee, and the 16th tees as well. Now, with all of that, it's just so good to see a golf course in the Blue Mountains taking the step for these upgrades. I've spoken to Harley Cruz, who's the architect on site, doing the rebuild and the redesign. It's going along in leaps and bounds, and they're absolutely smashing the work out, and it looks fantastic. This, for the golf course up there at Blackheath, this is an absolutely wonderful improvement on the course, and it's going to start to integrate the fun factor to the golf course again. It's an upgrade. It's a modern update for the golf course. Hasn't been done since 1991 from memory, when I was a kid. 91, I'm pretty sure it was 91. So it's been a long time, and the greens were starting to struggle. They were very, very old greens. The first was one of those ones done in 91. The 16th was an original green. The 18th was an original green. So the best part of sort of, when I say original, very, very old. They're probably pushing sort of 70 years, 60, 70 years plus in terms of age. So good to have those green sites redesigned, including bunkers and approaches and everything. So it's just really, really cool. Harley's doing some great stuff out there on course, and really looking forward to seeing it grow in. Part of the rebuild is that and I know Superintendent Luke Skinner is just champing at the bit, because they're getting an upgraded irrigation system, and he has really struggled with a really old, antiquated, outdated, somewhat broken irrigation system. And through summer, it makes life incredibly hard. And they're getting an upgraded irrigation system through this process as well. So very, very exciting for Blackheath. And a little cool thing, this is what I love to see. I remember when Kalara were rebuilding, and they stripped their greens off before they were rebuilding their greens. They stripped the old surfaces off. And it went to Branxton Golf Club up the Hunter Valley near the wine region. There's a small sort of township called Branxton. It's got a little 9-hole golf course, and they got the turf from Kalara. And it's a great thing to see some of this turf being reused around either smaller clubs or different areas. Get this, Blackheath, they stripped their greens off before they were being dug up, and none other than Superintendent of New South Wales Golf Club in Sydney, Mark Parker. They wanted to get some of the turf from the surface of the old greens at Blackheath, because they were going to be rebuilding some of their bunkers at New South Wales, the riveted bunker faces with a stacked layered turf. So Mark got in touch with Luke at Blackheath and said, listen, you got some turf going. Do you mind if we come up and grab it? Because we want to rebuild some of our riveted faces around some of our bunkers. Perfect stacked, greens fresh side. How good's that? So when you're playing New South, and for those that are members down there, you get a piece of Blackheath Golf Club's history around your bunkers. So I think they're really good ways of recycling turf too, not just being dug up and just, mixed through or turfed. Or when I say turfed, pardon the pun, that was terrible. Being thrown away, let's go with that. It's great that they're being reused. So really, really good to see what's happening of that recycled turf being used down in the bunkers at New South Wales. So that's a bit of a good result in the end. But lots going on at Blackheath, one that I will be showing you and keeping your eyes on. So don't worry about that. Move to Woollahra Golf Club, still in Sydney, next door to Rose Bay, next door to Royal Sydney Golf Club. Now, Woollahra, I didn't know, but they've resurfaced their 6th green down there on course recently, and it's been growing in quite well. They've obviously stripped the surface back, wanted to relay it, re-level it. Some minor design modifications to the green, nothing too dramatic, but a brand new green coming in. So that'll be online soon. that you won't be too far away. You'll be able to play to it. So for those that enjoy the public course at Wallara, next door to Royal Sydney at Rose Bay, you will have a brand new 6 green that's growing in and won't be far away for play. Fantastic. And we continue in the eastern suburbs of Sydney with St Michael's Golf Club. Now, I've spoken to you that they've been rebuilding their 11th green complex at St Michael's, and some of the stuff coming out, the images coming out of that green, it is growing in so well from seed. They've been cutting it down to 5 mil, top dressing it up now. It's not too far away from play. I won't say that it's very soon, but you're probably looking, potentially, I guess, in the new year there or thereabouts. But it's looking super sharp, super slick. Won't be too long. That hasn't been out of play for terribly long, but really exciting to get that green back in play for the members and plenty of the social players that enjoy visiting St Michael's there on the cliff tops of the eastern suburbs of Sydney, being next door to New South Wales. There's St Michael's. For those that don't know, that aren't from Sydney, it's on a beautiful strip of coastline, and a new 11th green is going to be a sensational addition to that golf course. So it's really coming along well through the growing season, and everyone is very happy at St Michael's to see how it's happening for them. So members and guests alike, really, really good stuff. And final one into New South Wales, we go up to the Hunter Valley. I took a trip up to the Hunter Valley a couple of weeks ago and went to the Vintage Golf Club. Now, I caught up with Superintendent Martin Crowe at the Vintage, and was having a bit of a chat with him about the course and what's been going on at the moment. And he tells me that one of the things that was a bit of a shortfall for the golf course was around their bunkers and around their bunker edges. They struggled with water a lot, and they struggled to keep the grass alive around the fairway bunkers that are just outside that reach of the sprinkler heads on the outside edges of the bunkers. So one of the things that have been going on there at the Vintage in recent months has been the installation of extra sprinkler heads around those bunkers. Now, it might sound a little bit backwards to have sprinklers right near the bunkers, but it doesn't really cause too much problems if they're put in the right position, or too many problems if they're put in the right position and they're used in the right way, that and not overwatered and all that sort of stuff. We get a bit of wash down, but they're being put around some of those fairway bunkers and areas that aren't getting the reach of the normal fairway irrigation. So they can have nice grass and turf around those bunker edges, around those lips, around those tongues, around those edges, and just to try and get a bit better maintenance and a bit more visual consistency for the golf course. And it does get very, very hot there in summer and can be very, very dry with the westerlies, and it's just a little bit further away from the coast, sort of an hour west of Newcastle, thereabouts. But yeah, so that's a new addition happening into the Vintage. So if you're a fan of the Vintage, I'm a fan of the Vintage. I do like it. It's a wonderful part of the Hunter Valley to go and enjoy visiting wineries, for example, but certainly for golf, there's a good couple of golf courses there that you'll enjoy playing. The Vintage is one of them, the Greg Norman Golf Course that he and his team designed, and some new irrigation stuff happening there, which is a positive for Martin and his team to look after the golf course. Final piece of walking the fairways today, guys, is in Queensland at Caloundra Golf Club. Now, I don't know a lot about Caloundra, but been seeing and reading about a little bit of information coming about that they're and these are the little things. This is the stuff that golf courses can do. They can't do a lot in springtime. It's all about maintenance, but some of the little things that they can do, like Caloundra, they've rebuilt their 18th fairway bunker. Now, that's obviously an area that was identified by the club that needed to be rebuilt. So they're in rebuilding it. It's got new drainage through the bottom of it, which is fantastic. This is what you need to do with bunkers. They do need maintenance, whether we like it or not, when you're not on a sandy site. So new drainage, new sand in the bunker itself, and a bit of a new shape, a bit of a new sort of redesign around the outsides with some new turf tongues coming down the bunker face there into the bunker. Adds a bit of shape, adds a bit of aesthetic value to your eye when you're playing the golf course, and certainly near that bunker itself. And it's starting to look really, really good. The shape, I think, is a really nice shape improvement. And, when you're doing renos at this time of the year, the growing season, these sorts of things, if you've got the scope to do it, are great little additions to do. And that's what's going to happen at this time of the year. It's all about maintenance now. Everything's growing, going hammer and tongs. And some of these little improvements are very, very good to keep ticking through along the way. One of the biggest things of walking the fairways, you've probably seen most golf courses at the moment have been completing or just about finished. So they've either finished or just about to finish their renovations around the place, whether it be greens, obviously mostly was probably a little bit earlier on, Now you're doing tees, they're doing fairways, they're scarifying, coring, aerating, whatever. Most of the stuff that's happening, it's go time for greenkeepers and superintendents and their teams on golf courses now, just going mental with those renovation plans. So before it gets too hot and while they're in the peak of growing temperatures, this is now the right time. So you've probably seen that happening at your golf course, at a golf course that you're thinking about going to play, golf courses where you have just played. Hopefully they made you aware that they were doing renovations. Nothing frustrates the living bejesus out of me more than turning up to a golf course and not knowing that they're in renovations. And I'm a big believer in communication. So whenever anyone books, the pro shop should be telling you, there should be notification online just saying that they're doing renovations. And you should be offered also, in my opinion, some sort of discount. That's my opinion. I'm a big believer in that sort of stuff, and it keeps people coming back. But hopefully that's what's happening. That's what you've been told. But you've been seeing a lot of it, hearing a lot about it. That's what's happening on in renovations time at this time of the year. So won't be too long now. That'll all be cleared up, grown out, and you'll be able to hit the straps and get out there and enjoy golf again in the good conditions that we know there are not post, but in the middle of still a La Nina period. So good rainfall's happening around the eastern coast of Australia, and the golf courses are looking spectacular. And if you're smart enough and you've had the chance and opportunity to travel west of the Great Divide to go and enjoy some country golf courses in Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland, you would have been loving the golf courses out there. They are really looking sharp, good growing conditions, and I'm seeing plenty of people traveling online on Instagram that are out there playing golf and taking photos of country courses that I haven't visited for a long time, and they are looking exceptional. So that's Walking the Fairways, guys, keeping you up to date as always. Keep enjoying your golf, and let's get stuck into the next segment. And now I welcome you to a new segment for the podcast. I'm going to call it Aussie Golf History. Now, this segment, I didn't know that I'd ever really do a history or a historical segment on golf. I do like reading into it a bit, certainly more about golf courses. As you know, that I'm a big fan of architecture and golf history and club history and that sort of stuff. But I probably didn't think that I would ever do anything like this, where I dive right in and find as much information as I can. But doing this segment with the subject person that I've decided to go with got me really, 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 I couldn't not put it in the podcast. It was so incredibly in depth in Australian golf that I just felt I had to tell as many people as possible. And this is my platform to do it. So hopefully you enjoy what I'm about to tell you. And Aussie Golf History today is Daniel Gordon Soutar, or Dan Soutar as he was known. Now, I mentioned that at the top of the podcast episode that it was on Dan Soutar. And I didn't realise this, but my old home club in Wentworth Falls has a connection with Dan Soutar. And I'll explain what that is later on as I run through his history in Australian golf. But I wished I'd have known these sorts of things when I was working at the golf course, working at the club, and had time to interact with more people. That some of the members that I knew were in their 80s and stuff at the club back in the early 2000s, and they probably knew a hell of a lot more about some of this history. They're now sadly since passed away, and I can't talk to those guys anymore, and I wish I could to get a little bit of info. But what I'm about to tell you about Dan Soutar, hopefully you'll enjoy, but I found quite astonishing in how much of a key person he was in Australian golf. And I'll just get into it, guys. I really hope you enjoy it. And I will say one last thing though before I get started, is that as a listener, I want you to try and focus on the names of some of the people that I mentioned here and talk about. And I want you to think where you may have heard those names before. And also, I'm going to talk about a lot of golf courses. So try and follow them as much as you can. And you'll hear names change. You'll hear places change. And, you might have played some of these golf courses before. You might have thought about playing them before. You might not have realised where they came about or when they started. So try and follow the names. Try and follow the golf courses and the club names. And some things, I think you'll be surprised in the evolution of things. And golf courses and golf names. I certainly was, and I didn't realise. But here goes. Dan Soutar. Let's go. Dan Soutar, now he was a Scot. He's from Scotland. Scottish background. Scottish born and bred. to a certain extent, to the age of 20, what would ultimately be before he moved on. But he was born in Scotland in 1882. Now, his family were not in the famous township of Carnoustie, as we now know. It's a famous township because of the golf course that's there. But they moved to Carnoustie when he was at the age of 5. And that's where he learnt to play golf, at Carnoustie. I mean, how good's that? Imagine picking up your first clubs and learning to play the game. For me, it was Wentworth Falls. I was 9 years old when we moved there, and that was wwhere I learnt to play the game of golf at 9. Fancy moving to Carnoustie at the age of 5 and learning that's my golf course, that's my home track, that's where I'm going to learn the game. How good would that? I mean, that astonishes me already, and I've only just started. So when he was 5, they moved to Carnoustie, and that's where he learned to play the game of golf on the famous golf course. Now, if you don't know, if you're getting into the game of golf, or you probably heard about some of the British golf courses, if you're not big into following tournaments and watching some of the stuff, and let's face it, there's plenty of people that aren't. I never really used to be. I was always focused on what I did for work and where I played. But if you're not sure about some of Carnoustie's history, I'll say this to you. It's so highly regarded that it has held 8 Open Championships, or British Opens. 8 Open Championships. Now, that is an incredible number of Open Championships. Considering the golf courses that the Open Championship travels to over there, that is astonishing. It's one of the highest number of times a golf course has held the Open Championship. So there you go. Carnoustie is one of the best in the homeland of golf, being Scotland. Now, as he grew up, Dan Soutar, he became a regular caddy at Carnoustie, so that would give you an intimate knowledge of the golf course and players and how to play the course, weather conditions and all that. Being a caddy is really gives you a wealth of knowledge about a lot of things to do with the game. And at that age of 14, when he became a regular caddy, he also became an apprentice carpenter. So he's pretty handy with his hands and doing things on the tools. So that's some of the skills that he got as a young kid growing up. During this time of being a caddy and playing golf regularly at Carnoustie, he befriended a guy by the name of Carnegie Clark. So remember that name, Carnegie Clark, which you may have heard of. Now, Carnegie Clark would go on to become a well-known architect in Australia in his own right. That's probably where you've heard the name. But he also befriended a guy by the name of James Hurd Scott, or Jazz Scott, as he was known. And these 3 guys used to all compete against each other in golf. They would all play against each other, compete different tournaments, different events, I should say, not so much tournaments back then when they were juniors, or what I call juniors, being teenagers. They would all compete against each other, playing golf at Carnoustie and around. That would be the beginnings of 3 very famous names in Australian golf and Australian golf history. So remember those names. Now, by 1902, Carnegie Clark had already travelled to Australia. So he was already over here, and he was working in a large sort of department store, sports store in Sydney, promoting golf. And he was on the road as well a little bit, promoting golf throughout New South Wales, along with teaching and selling lots of golf products. And this particular company wanted him to go on to be to start ball manufacturing, golf ball manufacturing, club manufacturing. Remember, this is very, very early on in Australian golf, but also early on in sort of how golf was expanding around the world and becoming a more highly played sport, and they required more clubs and more balls and more different advancements in technology as time goes on. But Carnegie had already come here in 1902. That was when Dan Soutar was at the age of 20. And Carnegie and Jazz Scott as well were all similar age. During that time, in 1902, Clark sent a message to a 20-year-old Dan Soutar and Jazz Scott. Now, they were on a boat on their way to settle in South Africa in 1902. But Carnegie Clark sent them a cable message that said, and this is quoted, that simply read, "Do not stop in Cape Colony. Proceed on to Port Jackson. Employment arranged." Full stop. That's it. That's all it was. So they were on a boat on their way to South Africa. Now, Cape Colony is the Cape of Good Hope. I had to do a little bit of research. I didn't know what Cape Colony was. The Cape of Good Hope in South Africa. You've probably heard of that. But Carnegie had already organised for these 2 friends of his, 2 mates, for work in Sydney. He wanted them over because he just wanted his friends to be with him, but in golf. Something was happening in golf. This is the way I sort of read. I've read a lot of historical newspaper clippings, doing all of this research. And some of the things that you'll see is that these guys sort of really started, they become famous names in golf, like I said, but they really sort of were at that cusp of the turn of golf in Australia. And this is basically it. So he sent this message to them: come over, guys, I've got work for you. I want you down here with me in Sydney, is basically what he said. Now, when they arrived in Sydney, Dan got to work straight away for the same company as Carnegie Clark, but it wasn't in golf because he was a chippy by trade. He was working in cabinet making and so on. Now, as far as golf goes, now I'm going to jump to golf now. That was sort of a little bit of them getting here. As far as golf goes, Dan Soutar could play golf. Carnegie Clark could play golf. Jazz Scott could play golf. These guys were very, very good at golf in their time. This is about Dan Soutar, so you'll hear those other names bounce in and out. But Dan got here shortly after arriving in Australia. He joined Marrickville Golf Club. Now, in turn, Marrickville would become Bonnie Doon. Okay, so we all probably heard of Bonnie Doon, but it was Marrickville Golf Club back then. And their golf course was over at Tempe, sort of a southwestern sort of inner suburbs of Sydney, not too far out of the CBD, down not too far from Sydney Airport, to be honest, where it is now, where it is today. And he joined Marrickville, only been here for 3 months. Dan entered into the 1903 Australian Amateur Championships. So they left in 1902, been here for a few months, turn of 1903. He's entered in the Australian Amateur Championships. Now, this was basically the precursor to the Australian Open, as we know it today. But back then, there were no professional golfers. It was about amateur golfers. There was no one really making a big living. There was not enough people making a big living in professional golf to have an Open Championship of professionals and amateurs. So it was the Amateur Championships. That's what it was. Now, that was held at Adelaide Golf Club's links at Glenelg. Remember that name as well. So there's lots of names to remember because these aren't the names you've heard of today. They do change. Adelaide Golf Club would later go on to become Royal Adelaide. It got the Royal moniker later on. But early on, in its early days, in 1903, their golf course, their links, was at Glenelg, on the coast down there in South Australia at Adelaide. In 1903, when Dan played the Australian Amateur Championships, he caught the eye of Cargie Reimel. That is another name which you might have heard. And this is the fascinating part about all of this, is that Cargie Reimel became a famous golf course architect in South Australia, in Adelaide. So his designs, for example, later on came to be Royal Adelaide Golf Club as we know it today, and Kooyonga, for example. That's just a couple of his courses down there in Adelaide. Spectacular golf courses, very highly regarded. He also said that his encounter with Dan Soutar playing in the 1903 Australian Amateur Championships really ignited his passion for golf. So I find that quite interesting, that watching Soutar play golf, Cargie Reimel's just really pumped about golf all of a sudden. He watched the event, watched Soutar play, and pinpointed that watching Soutar play that event really got him going. So then he later went on and become to be very prominent in golf in Adelaide, which is really fascinating. Now, later that year, so this is a measure of how good Soutar was at golf. Later that year, he also won the New South Wales Amateur, which he followed up by winning it again in 1904, the following year. And in 1904, he entered his first and the first Australian Open, as we know it. Now, it was called the Open Championship of Australasia. Again, a different name, but it was the Australian Open, where there were, in that 1 year leap from 1903 to 1904, all of a sudden there was a larger number of professional golfers around. So to have that mix, it was an open event, Open Championship, and that was then introducing professional golf and amateur golfers together. But it was still much the amateur golf which was the top dog, because the Open Championship was a qualifying event for the amateur championships. Work that out. I found that fascinating too. But anyway, the 1904 Australian Open, I'll call it just for argument's sake, was held at the Australian Golf Club, and it was their link, so that's in Sydney, and it was their golf course back when it was located at Botany in Botany Bay in Sydney. Now that is basically, obviously it no longer exists because the Australian Golf Club's at Kensington, but back then the links was at Botany Bay, and that's where Sydney Airport is located today. So ultimately, Sydney Airport would take that land in time, and things changed. So that's where it was located in 1904. Soutar would ultimately finish third in that event, 9 strokes behind the first ever, or the inaugural winner of the event, which was the Honourable Michael Scott. But importantly, he was 1 stroke ahead of Carnegie Clark. I found that quite fascinating. These two have tussled a lot over the years as teenagers, and then coming into being high-profile golfers in the biggest events in the country, they were still competing tooth and nail with each other. So he beat Carnegie by 1 stroke. The top 3, including Soutar, were amateurs. And coming in fourth was Carnegie Clark, who was the highest placed professional. So the first Australian Open, the top 3, 1, 2, 3 were amateurs, and then was the first place professional. That's quite interesting as well. So that shows you how many people were amateurs and how many people were professionals. So, like I said, it was the infancy of golf in Australia, professional golf in Australia as well, and there wasn't a lot of professional golfers out there. And making money in the game back then wasn't in existence. It wasn't anything quite like it was today in sport, and it was very much professional golfers in its infancy in Australia. Now, just to put things into context, in the late 1800s, and this is why there wasn't a lot of professional golfers around, in the late 1800s, golf clubs were only just starting to get established in each capital city around Australia. Now, I'm talking Adelaide Golf Club, Melbourne Golf Club, Brisbane Golf Club, Perth Golf Club, Launceston Golf Club in Tassie, Sydney Golf Club, and the Australian Golf Club. Now, you probably don't really know many of those names. Adelaide Golf Club will go on to be Royal Adelaide. Melbourne would again go on to be Royal Melbourne. Yeah, they're the sorts of things that would happen with these clubs, and that's their iteration and how they came to be, and their names changed as time went on. Now, bear in mind that the Australian Golf Club is the oldest existing club in Australia today, the oldest continuous existing golf club in Australia today, which began life in 1882. So that's really interesting. Our country, by modern standards, isn't a very old country, by modern standards, but to have a golf course like that in our modern history, that's quite old, 1882 to 2020. You're nearly looking at 140 years, not quite. That's how old the Australian Golf Club is. Quite remarkable. When you look at the golf courses there today, you probably don't realise that it is that old and that historic. But it's moved sites twice before that. It was at Botany for the 1904 Australian Open. And that was then the third move after that, which ultimately took it to its current site at Kensington as we know it today. So quite interesting that golf courses moved around a lot as well back then. So I do find that quite fascinating. Soutar would have his next chance at winning the Australian Open the following year in 1905. But this time he would be a professional because he joined his friend Carnegie Clark working and teaching at Royal Sydney Golf Club. So Carnegie was at Royal Sydney. He moved on to Royal Sydney and he got Dan over to join him. Now, this time the Open was held in Royal Melbourne, but it was at its old golf course at Sandringham, which incidentally is the site of the current Sandringham golf course across the road from Royal Melbourne, which I keep reminding myself I have to call Sandy Links now after its new branding, rebranding and rebuild. So that was the original golf course of Royal Melbourne before it moved to the dual golf course site that it is today at Black Rock. So quite interesting as well what courses were dropped and then new ones were built and all that sort of stuff by golf clubs. Something very interesting that you continue to see along the way in a lot of other places. So it was at Royal Melbourne. Now get this. This is really cool. This is pretty funny. Before you could jump on a plane to go from Sydney to Melbourne, how did you get from Sydney to Melbourne to play in the Australian Open? You couldn't jump on a plane. They didn't do it back in 1905. There was no dual carriageway highway from Sydney to Melbourne where you couldn't drive there in 9.5 hours like there is today. So how else would you go down to the event in 1905 to play the Australian Open? You'd have to go by boat, wouldn't you? It took these guys 3 days to travel from Sydney to Melbourne by boat. Now, that's commitment right there, people. I don't care what you say. If you're traveling 3 days by boat to go from Sydney to Melbourne, which today we can drive in a day, less than a day, is quite remarkable. But Soutar went on to win. So after that epic adventure, Soutar went on to win the event by 10 strokes over the Honourable Michael Scott and 12 strokes this time over his mate Carnegie Clark. Like I said, Dan could play. These guys could play. They were real golfers. Dan would also win the Australian PGA Championship of that same year as well. So he was pumping golf out by this stage in his prime, hitting his straps. In 1906, the Open was held at Royal Sydney. So it's basically Carnegie, Clark's, and Dan Soutar's home course. But it was their new course at Rose Bay. And Soutar, and I say new because that's where they moved to, Soutar would ultimately finish second, 5 shots behind Clark. So Clark this time had the advantage. And Soutar would continue to finish runner-up for the next 4 Opens straight and runner-up a total of 7 times. So he might not have won as many as he possibly could have, but like I said, he could play golf. So this guy's come over from Scotland at the age of 20, straight into it and straight into Australian golf and just pumping out good golf against some quality opponents. Really, really good. Now, he did win the PGA Championship also, again in 1906, as he did the year before, and he would go on to win another 2 PGAs, Australian PGAs. So, like I said, playing good golf. It was during 1906 that Soutar had his first crack at golf course design. So this is when it started for him. This is what I'm getting into, is the golf course design side of Dan Soutar as much as the golfer. So he designed his first golf course. It was a 9-hole golf course, and it was out west. It was on the police paddock in Mudgee. Now, Mudgee is a great wine region of Australia, certainly of New South Wales. And that's where he would design his first 9 holes. Now, that golf course is no longer in existence, but it was the very first golf course for Mudgee Golf Club. So that's when Mudgee Golf Club started in 1906. So it's got a long history. Now, like I said, the course doesn't exist anymore, but in that year, he also penned, so this is his second chance at design. He penned a design for Adelaide Golf Club's new course to be built at Seaton. And this is when I said Adelaide Golf Club would go on to become Royal Adelaide, as that's the site the golf course is now for Royal Adelaide. And Dan had a design back in 1906 that he did for Adelaide Golf Club, or for Royal Adelaide Golf Club. And unfortunately, this design didn't get the nod from the club, but he was in the mix. He was very much in the mix. And some of those, it's talked about that some of the sites that you see there today are on Dan's design. Now, they've still got a copy of Dan's original design for the golf course that he drew up, and that's on display in the clubhouse at Royal Adelaide. I've been fortunate enough to go to Royal Adelaide, like I've mentioned before, and I've seen it hanging up on the wall. Unbelievable piece of history. And I love seeing that stuff around. So in his early days, he had a crack at one of what I think is one of the best golf courses. Well, everyone thinks it's one of the best golf courses, but I think it should be regarded even more so, is Royal Adelaide. So he might not have got the nod overall, but some of the greens do double up in what Cargie Reimel come up with and what they eventually built, and obviously what was eventually done a little bit modified as well from Dr. Alistair Mackenzie at Royal Adelaide. So very, very interesting to have that plan up on the wall in Royal Adelaide, and the clubhouse is just magnificent. So pretty impressive stuff. And in 1906, now this is something I found out. I didn't realise that Dan Soutar was an author. So he wrote a famous Australian golf book. And I've never really been into golf books as such. I love my architecture books, but a golf book, this was one of the first books on Australian golf, and it was called The Australian Golfer, and it used to teach people how to play the game and a bit about playing golf in Australia and that sort of stuff. And it's a very, very expensive book if you can find it for sale. I've seen some things for an example of it for sale. That is a piece of Australian golf history in itself. And again, from the early days, considering Dan had only been here for 3 years, the things that he's already achieved in golf, and he'd been here for 3 years, is quite staggering, and something very much to be impressed by on his CV as we continue to look into what Soutar was able to achieve in his time here in Australia for Australian golf. So I'm going to touch on a little bit of Dan's personal life, only briefly, and I'll come back to it a little bit later on as we talk. But it was also in 1906 that Dan would meet his future wife because she was a bridesmaid at Carnegie Clark's wedding, which they were both at, and he was Carnegie's best man. So he met his future wife there, and we'll come to that a little bit later on, because there's something there. If you know Sydney and the Blue Mountains, you'll probably know a little bit more of that when it comes through. And interesting. But we'll come to that later. So he stayed working at Royal Sydney with Carnegie Clark until 1907. And when he left Royal Sydney, he became the pro at Marrickville, which, as I mentioned, became Bonnie Doon. And he became the pro there at their new course, which was along the Cooks River at Arncliffe, again, just southwest of Sydney Centre, what's the CBD now, near Sydney Airport. And that was a course that he stayed at there as pro until 1909. And during 1907, he designed another famous course in Sydney, that being Concord Golf Club. Now, Concord Golf Club was kind of a split to that of Royal Sydney Golf Club or Sydney Golf Club, as back in 1898, Concord was where Sydney Golf Club's first golf course was. And that's where it was located before they built their other course in the eastern suburbs at Rose Bay, being where it is now. And during this time, some of the members decided that they wanted to stay at Concord. So why not start their own club? Sure, as you do. So they did. And eventually, and Royal Sydney was playing at both courses. Eventually, Royal Sydney dropped Concord and solely went out of the Rose Bay Golf Course. And the new Concord Golf Club basically was formed and engaged Dan Soutar in 1907 to design their new golf links. Really, really interesting stuff that these clubs and these courses are all starting to come together, and we're starting to understand where they came from, all through Dan Soutar's story, which is really fascinating, I reckon. So after leaving Bonnie Doon in 1909, he then took up the role of manager of the golf club and professional at the club of the Blue Mountains Golf Club, which, as we know it today, is Leura Golf Club in the township of Leura, just on the south side of the town centre. And he was there for more than a year, there or thereabouts. Now, whilst working and living in Leura, he would marry Annis Jackson, and that's who he met in a few years earlier at Carnegie's wedding. And a random tidbit, now this is where I suppose my life and being in the Blue Mountains and growing up in the Blue Mountains, and I really wish that when I lived there that I knew a lot of this stuff, but I didn't, so be it. A random tidbit is that Dan and Annis's wedding, the actual ceremony, they got married at Wentworth Falls Presbyterian Church. Now, this is on a little side tangent, right? But the strange, weird part about it is, incidentally, that church is right next door to the primary school that I went to growing up in Wentworth Falls Primary School. How was I to know that Dan Soutar was married, albeit 80 years earlier than me going there, at the very church right next door to the school grounds, which I just found really fascinating. Reading it, I know these areas, I know these buildings, I know these places, I know these addresses. It was really, really interesting and fun reading all this sort of stuff. So I'll take any connection to Dan Soutar. I'll have it, no worries. After the wedding, they returned in the evening to a place called the Palace in Leura. And like me, for anyone that knows the Blue Mountains, the Palace later became known as the Ritz Hotel in its prime, and it's still located at the bottom of Leura Mall, albeit now it's a nursing home. But that's another connection for me with Dan, because I bought my first house in Leura at the top end of Leura Mall. So again, just these really cool things that I was reading and finding out, whilst researching Dan and his story. I was totally fascinated by a lot of this stuff that I knew. I know these places. It's quite coincidental, I'll call it, but I do like it. So in 1911, he travelled to New Zealand, where he played some exhibition matches, and he also designed a new course for Christchurch Golf Club. He then moved back to Sydney to take up a role at Manly Golf Club as their head professional. So he's travelled everywhere, done everything playing golf and all this sort of stuff. And it fascinates me that these golf clubs that we know of, he touched them. He designed them. He was there playing golf on them. He was competing at them. I love the story, and it goes on. So in the same year, Dan was instrumental in 1911. So this is a key part. So he was instrumental in establishing the PGA of Australia. And he served as a national chairman until 1919, and then again from 1928 to 1930. But there was a group of these guys in 1911 that come together, and the key names were Dan Soutar and Carnegie Clark, and they formed the very beginnings of the PGA of Australia. So here was these Scottish guys that emigrated to Australia, And they basically gave birth to more or less the rise of golf in this country. It really started. A lot of things began from these guys. And Dan Soutar was a key to a lot of them. So after returning from New Zealand, he went back to Mudgee, but this time he designed a 9-hole course on the south side. So that the one in the police paddock was gone. He designed a 9-hole course on the south side of Mudgee Township, which I believe is the site of the existing golf course that is there today. Now, Mudgee is an 18-hole golf course today, and it's a fantastic country golf course. You just love it if you get out there. And anyone who's played there knows what I'm talking about. Sensational course, and quite possibly the best greens, bent greens, I reckon, west of the range. They're just always sensational. So whilst working at Manly Golf Club in 1913, he was engaged to design a 9-hole course at Wentworth Falls in the Blue Mountains. Now, that is my home track. If anyone knows me, that's my home track. I've talked about it on Instagram recently, made a trip up there. I had no idea that Dan Soutar designed that golf course. I lived next door to it. I worked at it. I played golf at it for most of my life. And here was one of the founding fathers of Australian golf who designed the golf course in 1913. I had no idea. And I want to understand more about this sort of stuff, especially being a member of the golf club. And I'll do that probably in another time, but interesting nonetheless. So this is the original 9 holes that he designed, and they're still the current holes on the front paddock of the golf course today. So if you play Wentworth Falls, it's holes 2 to 9. I'm not sure where the 9 holes fits in. Obviously, that's 8 holes of the original paddock, but I know that there's a few different green positions. So they might have squeezed in another par 3 in that paddock in the early years. I'm not sure, but yeah, interesting nonetheless. Another few years later, he was engaged again by Concord after they'd purchased new land to design their brand new golf course. So I think what I said before was their original golf course that he designed. They'd then purchased more land, and they wanted Dan Soutar back to redesign and build this brand new golf course on what they felt was their final purchase of land, the best property that they could get, and that is the land that the golf course sits on today at Concord Golf Club. And if you've been there, it's recently been redesigned in terms of the holes and the way that they play and the green sites and all that sort of stuff and bunkering on the side. It's done by Tom Doak and Renaissance Golf, and they've done an incredible job. But basically that land and a lot of the routing is still very, very similar to what Dan Soutar did back in 1916. Quite remarkable. In 1917, he did some more design work for Barrel Golf Club with Carnegie Clark down in the Southern Highlands. Another year later, he made some changes, some suggestions for some course changes and improvements at Manly Golf Club where he was working, and these were taken on board by the club at the time, which were great. So he started to really get into this design stuff a lot in Australia, and a lot of these golf courses were born with his markings and his creativity. Things that I didn't know. A lot of these clubs are well-established golf clubs. You've heard the ages of them in and around Sydney and further afield from New South Wales, and they're Dan Soutar courses. And this was mesmerising to me, finding and reading all about this sort of stuff. And in 1919, there was an interesting series of articles written in the Sydney Sun, as the paper was back then, by Dan Soutar, and he really talked about. Look, I'm gonna try and paraphrase some of his writings because I did find them very, very interesting at the time. And anyone who knows New South Wales, you'll probably find his commentary and his eye for detail of the landscape quite interesting. So I'll just quickly show you what I mean. And he talked about Newcastle Golf Club quite a lot too, which is he thought Newcastle was fascinating. So he's, at this time of the year when most golfers are on holidays, one cannot but notice the dearth of really good seaside links and the opportunity that invites shire and municipal councils or private enterprise to cater for that class of the community. Golf is a universal game, he goes on to say, and its devotees will follow the flag more zealously than the devotees of any other sport. This has been proved over and over again, both in America and the old country, where every opportunity has been taken to foster the spirit. Many a village in Scotland owes its existence to the establishing of golf links. And this is the part that I find really fascinating because I know the Blue Mountains quite differently to how it was 100 years ago. He goes on to say, at least one of the townships in New South Wales, Lura, has the same distinction. Take the golf course away from these places and the places are done. So how I know the Blue Mountains and growing up there as a tourist destination for the landscape and for the national parks and the cliffs and the scenery and all those beautiful natural spaces, in 1919, the Blue Mountains Golf Club, as it was back then, was what Lura was known for, is what he's writing in this article in the paper. I find that really interesting that it was that popular to travel to Lura for golf and not really much else. Now, that's coming from the eyes of a golfer, obviously a professional and someone who's very high up in the game in Australia at that time. That's really fascinating that that's how Lura was viewed. Now, if you go to Lura now, it's quite a different place. Very much about the landscape and tourism born out of the natural beauty of the area. But he's saying that back in that era, 1919, which is 101 years ago, that if you took the golf course out of Lura, there wouldn't be much of Lura there to go for. So quite fascinating that people would travel to that mostly by train and back then, no doubt it was steam train as well, to play golf. And it was obviously a fascinating sight. This is a little bit of detail that I love that he goes on to say. Most, and I quote, most of the seaside links that we read about, St Andrews, Prestwick, Deal, Sandwich, to mention some of the championship courses, are laid out on land that would be classed as good grazing land, but not suitable for intense cultivation. They are ideal for golf courses, sandy soil with grass short. There must be similar country in New South Wales. Now, this is what I like to read, in that he's really looking for more places to build golf courses, for more good golf, like it was in the old country, as he puts it, more links land golf. Listen to what he's got to say here. There must be similar country in New South Wales. Take a radius from Newcastle in the north to Jervis Bay in the south. Both are within easy reach of Sydney by rail or car. The links of the Newcastle Club at Stockton, which is Newcastle Golf Club as we know it today, are my ideal of a seaside course. Although to the casual observer, the scrub may be at a drawback. But when estimating the possibilities of a probable seaside golf course, it must be taken into consideration that all our seaside country is scrubby. And when it is cleared, it comes very close to the recognisable standard. So he could understand what he was seeing in the landscape. Bear in mind, as far as Europeans go and their understanding of Australian landscape was in its infancy, even though they'd arrived in the late 1700s. They'd nearly been here for 100 and something years already by the time Dan Soutar had been here. But still, he was looking for golf country, and it wasn't visible in the same way it was back in the British Isles. But he could see the natural golf country that was there. He knew what he was looking for. And he goes on to say that when travelling by tram or train, and I quote this again, but when travelling by tram or train, I often think of such and such a place as good golfing country. For example, the land on which the township of Brookvale outside Manly is built would have made a golf course that golfers would enjoy. Further out, Mona Vale is most suitable country for golf. And a course laid out there was for a time most popular, but for some reason was allowed to lapse. Now, he talks about a course called Le Corniche, which was a 9-hole private golf course built just to the north of where Mona Vale Golf Club is today. I've read a lot of these historical newspaper articles, and as they talk about and excerpts as they talk about this little 9-hole course that was built. But this was built north of where the existing Mona Vale Golf Course is. So Dan had seen this country here at Mona Vale that he talks about, and he knew it was good for golf, even still that a 9-hole course was lost and forgotten about. But he knew that there was something there. And Mona Vale sits in a low-lying spot. It's a very, very nice location for a golf course. Probably not the best use of the ground. It could have been done better in my opinion, but it is still a very good golf course and a very enjoyable course to play. Now he goes on to say, the country around Tuggerah Lakes and Wyong, which is to the north of Sydney on the way up the Central Coast, is most suitable for golf, being sandy and level, but undulating. Anyone considering the question of establishing golf links north of Sydney ought to keep Tuggerah Wyong district in view. Now, Magenta Shores is a golf course, albeit built on an old tip site, but it's a golf course built on sand in a beautiful sandy location in a similar region to where Dan Soutar's identified here. Another one's Tukley Golf Course, which I know of is quite a nice location for a golf course, be it a public access one. There are other courses around there on good sites. It's very hard to build a golf course in these populous areas of Sydney. It probably wasn't taken advantage of in the same way it was around Melbourne, down in the Sandbelt, with the private courses and some of the ground that they have, which is just the most incredibly beautiful ground. And now you're starting to see it further down the Mornington Peninsula. But in Sydney, 101 years ago, Dan Soutar identified these regions that had beautiful golfing country, like, as he calls it, similar to the old country. Really fascinating to get an insight into the mind of Soutar. And these are articles that he's writing for the newspaper. That you wouldn't see this sort of stuff in the newspaper today. No one does this sort of thing anymore. What a beautiful mind he had for golf and identifying golf land. And he was always looking for the next thing for golf, to do for golf, to advance for golf in Australia. I love reading that. And when you look at the original article, it's just quite remarkable that, we're looking at these places that he's identified. Unreal. So I move on. In 1921, he moved to the New Moore Park Golf Course in Sydney. Now, that was a Carnegie Clark design, where he stayed there for 10 years. And that's the golf course that I've talked about recently, where Clover Moore's trying to shut down the 18-hole course. She's trying to cut it in half to 9 holes. And in 1921, Dan Soutar was there, and I think it was only a couple of years before that, or a year before that, that Carnegie Clark had basically designed that golf course a couple of years earlier. So it is a historic course. It has got a hell of a lot of history in Sydney, and now it's so close to the CBD, it's basically consumed by it. It's really such a beautiful spot. During his time at Moore Park, Dan really started to hit, if you'd thought what he designed already that I talked about, he really started to hit his straps from 1921 onwards. Listen to this. In 22, he designed a 9-hole golf course at Armidale. So that's up in the northwest of New South Wales, or the northern tablelands of New South Wales. But this 9-hole course didn't remain in play for very long, and I'll come back to Armidale. In 23, that was the big year for Dan. He travelled to Brisbane and laid out Indooroopilly Golf Club's first golf course at their site, which was set to become St Lucia Golf Course as they moved a little bit further south, only by a couple of blocks of land, to where they have now a 36-hole facility. But 23, he did Indooroopilly. And in 23, Soutar designed his most famous piece of Australian golf course art. And that was a new golf course for the Elstonwick Golf Club after their existing municipal golf course land was threatened to be taken away from them. Now, this club would become known as the one and only Kingston Heath Golf Club. So Soutar, for those that know Kingston Heath, you're members of Kingston Heath, you know Soutar. You guys celebrate what he did down there for your golf course, and it's quite incredible and one of the best golf examples in this country. It's always at the top. I think it's number 3 at the moment on one of the digests or something, top 100s. Always held in high esteem and very, very high regard. And Soutar was the architect. I'll go through a little bit more about it. It was around the time that this was interesting. This was really interesting to read. It was around the time that golf encountered a technological advancement with the advent of, wait for it, the rubber cord golf ball. Now, this was a big deal. We talk about now the advancements in golf balls and flights and how they're made and clubs and how far they hit. This was a big deal back then, from the gutter balls and the feathery balls. The rubber cord golf ball was changing the way people could hit the golf ball by so much more. They could hit it so much further. Now, with this in mind, the club decided that any new golf course that they would build should be made as long as possible. Their brief to Soutar was, and I quote, "Design a course to championship standards which will stand the test of time." Simple. And he delivered in spades with a course that would measure a monstrous 6,812 yards and was well and truly the longest golf course in the country at that time. Now, I'm talking 1923, right? Now, it was designed by Soutar without bunkers. And that's an interesting point. It was designed by Soutar without bunkers, and the construction was overseen by the legendary golf course builder and greenkeeper in Mick Morecambe. As we know, he was the man behind the construction of Royal Melbourne with Dr. Alistair Mackenzie, and he was loaned by Royal Melbourne to Kingston Heath for this build. Now, it wasn't uncommon back then for golf courses to be built without bunkers first, usually around costing reasons, and they would be added in at a later stage. So it'd build the 18 holes or build the 9 holes or whatever, and then they would come in the next year or the year after and start to work through adding the bunkers and those sorts of embellishments, as Harley Cruz calls it, around the golf course. So they wouldn't do everything first like we do in modern standards. People expect that today, but back then it was do it as you could afford it. And the biggest part was, let's get the golf course in first and we'll do the little details soon after. So that was how the golf course was built without bunkers. And after a visit from Dr. Alistair Mackenzie and his renowned 1926 visit to Australia, it would ultimately become one of Australia's best golf courses. Now, unfortunately for Soutar, once Kingston Heath had heard of Mackenzie's impending visit, and this is obviously 3 years after Kingston Heath was built, they decided to seek his services for bunkering the golf course, which, unbeknownst to Soutar, was at his expense. So he wouldn't be part of it anymore. Now, it should be noted that Mackenzie was so impressed with Soutar's design that his only comments were, and I quote, "There is little for me to suggest." Now, if you're a member at Kingston Heath, this is probably quite interesting. And if you're a fan of Dan Soutar's, this is fascinating. He says, "There is little for me to suggest with the exception of a bunkering scheme. I would suggest that the course be slightly shortened, as it is somewhat too long, even for a championship links." Now, that's fascinating coming out of back then. And like I said, the brief was to make it as long as possible. The club ultimately would take on Mackenzie's bunkering scheme, which, as we know, is quite possibly the best course bunkering on the planet. I'll just go out there and say it. They would take on his bunkering scheme and one of his suggested hole alterations. Now, that hole alteration was the shortening of the 15th hole at Kingston Heath to an uphill par 3. Now, it was built as a short par 4 to a blind green that was up over the hill and a little bit further along. He suggested bringing it back to an uphill par 3. And as we know, it's become one of the country's greatest and most prominent, well-known par 3s. But they didn't take on his suggestion to shorten the overall course length, with one committee member saying, and I quote, this is quoted, If we are proved to be wrong, it will be easier to shorten the course than lengthen the course." And I think that's quite telling of the mindset that they had at Kingston Heath back then, because as we know today, it's very hard to gain more land outside your space that you own, or to squeeze in a tee further back in the existing space that you have. So they went for the other method, and that would have no doubt have been an expensive exercise to do back then in 23 when it was originally designed. So unbelievable golf course, and Kingston Heath is on most people's bucket list. And I think now, after reading more of this and understanding more of this, I really, really want to see Kingston Heath. I've never seen it myself, but all these little details fascinate me so much about the mindset of Dan Soutar and just some of the historical things. And these have become historical golf courses. These are moments in Australian golfing history that happened that have got us to where we are today. We should be celebrating some of this stuff more than we already are. And the more I read over this stuff again and again, and I still love it. So 1923, we go on. He designed a 9-hole golf course at Middlehead in Sydney for the Mossman Golf Club. Now, that no longer exists. Quite remarkable. I know Mossman reasonably well now. I do a bit of work around that area. I can't believe there was a 9-hole golf course there. I'd hate to think how much that land would be worth if it was still there today. It's one of the richest suburbs of Sydney. It's one of the more affluent suburbs of Sydney. It'd be like, I don't know, putting a golf course in St Kilda or Brighton in Melbourne. Quite an unusual place to have a golf course. They wanted one, but obviously time would then take its toll on that golf course, and it makes sense. Trust me, when you go there, it's gone, sadly. He also designed, so we continue on. He went back up the Blue Mountains and designed the extension of Wentworth Falls to a full 18-hole golf course. He designed the first 9 holes of a new course in Sydney, Roseville, which, if you know Sydney, you would have heard of Roseville. A new course at Mittagong in the Southern Highlands near Bowral. He took off to Townsville and looked at doing a new layout for the North Queensland Golf Club. And in 24, he went on to design another 9-hole course, being that of Avalon Golf Club and Sydney's Northern Beaches. Now, Avalon opened in 1926, and it's still there. That's a 9-hole golf course, still 9-hole golf course. Again, the Northern Beach is probably one of the more affluent and pretty well-established suburbs of Sydney's Northern Beaches. Avalon is. I'm not too far from there, and I've been up there past it, and there's some pretty amazing properties around there. But to do it back then was quite interesting, and you can still go there and play it today. Now, the interesting part about Avalon was it was probably one of the earliest examples that I can find of a golf course used as a marketing tool for a housing subdivision. So when I've seen a lot of the historical ads in the newspapers for Avalon when I was researching all this stuff, they used Dan Soutar's image for advertising. They had him play exhibition golf games there for advertising with wealthy people that wanted to play with him or play on the course in the same event as him. And some of this stuff looked fascinating. I mean, the marketing hasn't changed in essence as it was 100 years ago. They still do the same sort of thing, but now we're seeing more housing developments around it. This was based around a wealthy man, and there was $1 million club names thrown around and all sorts of stuff in the historical articles that I've read. Quite fascinating, but it was done by a wealthy man. Come up with the idea, build a 9-hole course, get one of the best architects in Australia to build it, and a big name in golf in Australia, Dan Soutar. We'll use him. We'll do this. We'll pay him, no doubt. And there you have it. It's changed a lot since then. No doubt. And there's certainly trees. And talk to Mike Clayton about trees on golf courses. Now Avalon's completely surrounded by trees. Some of the historical photos that I've seen, there's no trees. It's a links seaside coastal golf course, but it's not anymore. You wouldn't know. And we keep moving on from the CV and repertoire of golf courses that Dan Soutar has designed. We get into 1925. He designed the second 9 holes for Roseville Golf Club in Sydney. And both he and Carnegie Clark went on to design Pymble Golf Club, which is on Sydney's North Shore as well, a private golf course. Pymble Golf Club's first golf course iteration of their site. And he also did a site report for New South Wales Golf Club that would turn out to be for him a little bit like Royal Adelaide, that it would be another big name that got away from him. So he had his hat in the ring for New South Wales Golf Club as well, and we all know where New South Wales sits in today's overall golf courses of the country, one of the best in Australia. But he was there, but sadly didn't get the nod. In 1926, he designed the second 9 holes for Longreef Golf Club. So it was a 9-hole course on that beautiful headland, which is just north of Manly. If you're been to the Northern Beaches, Longreef's one of the golf courses that you've got to play. And he designed the extension of that golf course to 18 holes. But all this is done. He knows the northern side of Sydney very, very well. In 26, remember, this was while he was still working at Moore Park Golf Course. So he was, I don't know how often he was there, but he was doing a lot. He had a hand in many, many things, and was a very, very, very busy man. In 27, he designed a new 18-hole golf course for Armidale Golf Club up in the Northern Tablelands of New South Wales. And a bit like Mudgee Golf Club, it's the golf course that still exists today. And if you haven't played there in your travels around New South Wales, you need to go and play it. It's a fantastic golf course, beautiful setting in the Northern Tablelands of New South Wales, and a sensational golf course it is to play. You'll absolutely love it. 28, he designed 18 holes for Bankstown Golf Course in the southwest of Sydney. He went on to do something for Wagga Wagga Golf Course, 18 hole design for their golf course in Wagga Wagga, which is a country town in southwestern New South Wales, more or less on the way to Melbourne. So this guy, he was everywhere. In 28, he would go on to design what would be the start of another big name golf course in Australia. And that was, he designed the first 9 holes for what would ultimately become Elanora Golf Club. And again, that's on Sydney's Northern Beaches. It's in a rise above the Narrabeen Lakes. It sits about 100 or so metres above sea level. And the course was built on one of the most unique sites for a golf course, I've got to be honest. It's rocky outcrops. It's up the hill. It's got quite a decent slope on the course itself, and he's routed the holes around quite well. And you got these beautiful, beautiful views. It was considered at the time great golfing country by Soutar, and the magnificent views over Narrabeen Lakes and out to the Pacific Ocean. Absolutely majestic and spectacular, certainly for back then, and it even still is today. And Eleanora's construction was overseen by the former greenkeeper of Royal Queensland. So when this club started, they wanted it to be one of the best in the country from the outset. So why not get one of the up and coming or the best greenkeepers at the moment? We'll just go and grab the guy from RQ, bring him down here, and he can oversee the build and the growing of the golf course, and we can have our 9 holes up and running. In turn, Eleanora would then get someone who I've mentioned already previously, Jazz Scott, to design their second 9 holes. So Eleanora really used the biggest names. It got the best people to build that were available, and they wanted it to be one of the best golf courses in the country. And clearly, that stands out because even today, it's considered one of the most beautiful golf courses in the country. But Eleanora itself was born as a bit of a breakaway, in a sense, from Royal Sydney Golf Club, and it was reported at the time to be built at great expense on this site at Eleanora. And you can just see how wealthy Royal Sydney Golf Club was on the whole with the membership. I mean, they started at Concord, they moved to Rose Bay, had the 2 courses, dropped Concord, built the new one at where Royal Sydney is now at Rose Bay, where it still stands today. A few iterations of that course to get to where they are today. Then they had this movement in 1928 where some of the members decided that they wanted to build a new golf course on the northern beaches. And they built this magnificent golf course up on this hillside with these magnificent views of the Pacific Ocean, an elevated golf course. And it's just like they were wealthy, and they were very knowledgeable people, very well connected people. And Eleanor was actually started as a bit of a golf course / housing development. So they sort of built this estate, is what they purchased, 518 acres of land. And they had 200 and something of it to be golf course, and the rest was going to be houses that they would sell off to basically sell the land off to fund the future of the golf club. So pretty smart people back then, obviously wealthy enough to buy it all and do it, as I just mentioned, selling property and land away as they wanted and needed to continue to fund how they built Eleanora. And as it stands today, it's one of the most exclusive private clubs in Sydney. And and is always considered one of the most best conditioned golf courses. I mean, I played it once a number of years ago now, quite a while ago, once only ever. And now I live about 3 minutes from it. And it is a very, very private golf course. Everyone knows about it, and I haven't even been back there since myself. Very, very, very private. Also very well talked about in terms of its quality of golf course, and its presentation levels are exceptional. Absolutely so. Now, after leaving Moore Park, later into when the Depression would hit Australia and the world, which made life tough for a lot of people to get good work. So Soutar had left Moore Park, the Depression comes in, and he went to work ultimately for F.J. Palmer & Sons department store in their golf section, and still teaching people the game of golf. And I suppose it's hard to wrap your head around just what the man Dan Soutar was, what he'd achieved in life in terms of professional golf and amateur golf, and how it all started, what he'd achieved in golf course design and architecture. He was at the beginning of starting some of the best and oldest and most well-known golf clubs in Australia, and he designed some of the best golf courses in the country, and that would go on to still be considered today some of the best golf courses in the country. And quite a remarkable legacy he's left. And he's a sort of a person where I think we probably don't celebrate him enough. I think they do in Melbourne. They celebrate it with Kingston Heath. The members celebrate the design that is Kingston Heath. That was their move to that new place. They wanted someone who was considered one of the best to design their golf course at the time. And, it was pre-Dr. Alistair Mackenzie coming, only just. And I think it's quite remarkable that all these golf courses that I've mentioned, only a couple of them mention Dan Soutar that designed their course. A lot of the country courses I talked about don't even make mention of. They don't even celebrate that he was there. You got to really go searching in the back catalogues of the deep, dark dungeons of the clubs to find some of this old literature of what he did in the early days and how he started their clubs. And I really think we really need to consider celebrating more of Dan Soutar's legacy and his history to Australian golf, not just what he'd won personally in his achievements in playing the sport, but what he's left us to enjoy in the sport. I find it sad. I wish that when I was at Wentworth Falls, that, like I said, working there, that I knew that he had designed the golf course there. I wish that working on course I would have loved to have gone and found some of the old stuff, some old reports and possibly old plans and things of the golf course to see what he had done. Maybe we could start, preserving some of that a little bit better. Would have been interesting to do. Sadly, I didn't get the chance to do it, and I no longer work there. Still a member there though. But an interesting thing. And like I said, other courses around the country, like your Concords and your Kingston Heath, celebrate him certainly more than some of the other places that are further afield that I've mentioned. And I find that a little bit sad. And I think he's been lost to the Dr. Alistair Mackenzie visit by a lot of courses, sadly. For me, finding all this stuff out, I found fascinating, captivating, enlightening, exciting, and hopefully to you guys listening, you'll have taken a little bit away from that and gone, wow, I didn't know that I've played that golf course and that he designed that course. I had no idea. Now, as I mentioned, Dan Soutar had worked for F.J. Palmer & Sons department store after leaving Moore Park. And to finish off, to show you where Dan Soutar's life had finished off in Australian golf, it was in 1937 that he was admitted to a private hospital in Sydney, a Randwick private hospital, with appendicitis. And he unfortunately contracted an infection and passed away in hospital at the age of 55. That was a very sad end to the astonishing life and achievements of Dan Soutar. And I say a sad end probably because in modern day standards, that's not something that you would often hear about, someone passing away like that with appendicitis and an infection at the age of 55. He did so much in his 35 years in Australia, from coming over by ship with a friend in Jazz Scott and meeting another friend in Carnegie Clark who was here, and those three guys being the cornerstone and the founding fathers, if you like, of Australia, professional golf in Australia. And they were the beginnings, or were part of the beginnings of the launch of golf in this country. And quite incredible, some of the golf courses overall that he's been part of, and golf events and tournaments, and how he was there at the beginnings of golf in this country and really bringing it up through the masses and promoting the game and being part of designing the game and all these golf courses that I mentioned. So quite amazing. What a life. Incredible. And all the time and all the weeks that I've spent researching all this, I've found it most interesting. And I hope you have too. I think looking at it, a couple of things that stood out to me was that it's interesting how many golf clubs move. Once they begin on a site, and then in the early days, they moved site and they had to build another golf course. And you see that with the Australian, you see that with Royal Sydney, you saw it with Kingston Heath, which was previously Elstonwick. We know that Royal Melbourne's moved on. So all these golf courses, Bonnie Doon, which was Marrickville, I could rattle and keep rattling them off, even Mudgee and Armidale, they all started and began and moved, which was quite interesting. And I think looking back, the way that they saw those moves, some of it was through, the war when land was taken over and different bits and pieces, ever expanding Sydney in by way of the Australian and Marrickville being Bonnie Doon. They saw these moves when their tenure had finished for whatever reason at their original sites. They saw it as a reason, as an opportunity to find a better piece of land, which is really interesting, because today I often sadly hear about golf courses that might need to move or have to move, or that naturally fall away and disappear because their land has to go for whatever the reason is, that they see it as a detriment. Members get disappointed and angry and frustrated. Now, I don't know if that happened back then, but it looks like back then they saw it as an opportunity to find new ground and make something special out of it. And in the case of Elstonwick, they would they got Dan Soutar involved. In case of Concord, they got Dan Soutar involved, and quite fascinating that that they were able to do that and start something special and create a legacy for their own club and for Australian golf. I think Melbourne has done it the best. We know that Melbourne's done it so well, being now I'm talking 120 years on from originally when all this sort of started with Dan Soutar coming to the country. But I think Melbourne's done it so well. They've embraced it. They've protected it and preserved it. And we know that they do it so well in the private courses down there in Melbourne and Victoria. And New South Wales has, in my opinion, probably got a little bit lost in its golf preservation, in its golf history, and in the way that I've talked about how golf courses are natural landscapes and they're natural environments, and they grow and they change, and you've got to maintain them, and it's not the easiest thing to do. And I think about what New South Wales as a state doesn't have so much of. We look with, I won't say envy, but in a sense, we look at what Melbourne and Victoria have in their age and history of golf courses that are there, that exist in the private courses, certainly. And even some of the public ones like Sandy Links, we look fondly at what they have, and we all want to go down there and see them. New South Wales, probably in Sydney, it was there in the early days. They were booming. They were some of the best golf clubs starting and preeminent clubs, but they've just lost their way a bit. We don't look at those golf courses in Sydney in the highest of esteem, essentially, anymore. We once did back then, but we don't anymore. And I'll give you an idea what I mean by that. Now, if you look at the listing of the top 100 golf courses in the country, you'll often find that most of the top 20 to 25 are southern golf courses, be it Victoria, Tasmania. There's some in New South Wales and certainly some in Adelaide. But most of them are from Victoria. And I talked about what Dan Soutar was involved with, and there was a lot of high quality ones starting out in Sydney. But, Sydney's become a lot more parkland style golf courses. And I talk about Royal Sydney. I talk about the Australian. We can list off a number of the larger ones, even Concord and, Eleanor as well. They've become parkland style golf courses. They've let trees grow. They've introduced trees. They've harbored that element and fostered that element and made themselves parkland style golf courses, which isn't often viewed as higher level as more open style, link style golf courses. I think that's where Sydney's lost its way and New South Wales has lost its way a little bit. And I'll talk about a book that I have. It's titled The 25 Great Australian Golf Courses, and it was done by Tom Ramsey, and it was released in 1981, 25 Great Australian Golf Courses. And in his list of 25 from 1981, Victoria had 10 golf courses, and they're all the ones we know. They're both courses at Royal Melbourne, Kingston Heath, Yarra. I looked through them. There's Barwon Heads, Victoria. So the list goes on of all the ones Commonwealth, all the ones we know of in Victoria. They had 10 courses in this 25 list. Now, this year, in the Golf Australia release of the top 100 golf courses in the country, in the top 25 of that list, now it's not essentially the same. Tom Ramsey it's just 25 great Australian courses. It's as close as I can find from 40 years ago to now, right? So Victoria had 10 courses in Tom Ramsey's 25. This year, the 2020 release of Golf Australia's top 100, the top 25 has 14 golf courses from Victoria in the top 25. So they've increased from 10 to 14, essentially, in 40 years. In Tom Ramsey's book from 1981, New South Wales had 7 golf courses. And in Golf Australia's top 25 of the top 100 from the year 2020, there's only 3 from New South Wales. That tells me what New South Wales and Sydney have let go. That tells me what we haven't fostered, what we haven't preserved, what we haven't improved and maintained. Look at what Victoria's done. From 10 to 14, and New South Wales has gone from 7 to 3. Really, really interesting snapshot of time, I think. Quite relevant. And I'll mention a couple from 1981 of New South Wales that aren't in the top 25 anymore. Newcastle was in Tom Ramsey's top 25. It doesn't make the cut anymore. Now, there are some new courses, Cape Wickham, Barnbugle, 13th Beach, all these ones that are in the modern day top 25. And they've bumped out all the old ones. You know, there's no Ocean Shore's got to start back in Tom Ramsey's one, which I found quite interesting. There you go. But Eleanor got to start. But the stalwarts from Victoria are still there today. You've got Barwon Heads, Commonwealth, Kingston Heath, Metropolitan, Royal Melbourne, both courses, Victoria, Yarra Yarra, they're all there, plus a few other modern day courses have been introduced, but New South Wales has lost a few. Quite interesting that we haven't preserved those golf courses and they've been sort of let go. Royal Sydney's out of the top. We're the only ones that we've got in New South Wales, the Lakes and Elliston. But Royal Sydney's out, the Australian's out, Eleanor's out. These are the courses that were back then were considered some of the best in the country. And they've been let go. I love the work that OCCM did at Bonnie Doon and brought it back. It's climbed the ladder. It's a fantastic golf course. The Lakes, look at what they did at the Lakes to keep it in the modern day top 25. OCCM, same people. Quite interesting and very, very fascinating. And I'm going to leave you with a final thought. And it's from the 25 Great Australian Golf Courses. And it's the foreword by Peter Thompson. And I love this. And I quote this. In general terms, golf courses should bring pleasure and excitement to those who play on them. The excitement part of it includes challenge and interest. The pleasure part comprises ease of progress and freedom of irritation and lost balls. The courses that make the grade have these things in abundance. And there's quite possibly none better or more prolific than Peter Thompson as a golf course architect in Australia. And he's designed some great courses and commentated about all of our great golf courses around as well. And I'll leave you with those words. But I hope you got something fascinating out of Dan Soutar and Aussie Golf History segment. I certainly did in my research. I hope you take something away. And if nothing else, I hope I've shown you what began or what part of Australian golf was started by some Scottish immigrants that come out to Australia, and Dan Soutar being one of those key people. Fascinating piece of history in Australia and golf, and it certainly got me thinking a lot more about how we've come to where we are today and where we came from. And that, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to the end of episode number 11, which is the episode before number 12. So I hope you got something out of this episode. It was a little bit different in that I wanted to talk about Dan Soutar and history of golf in this country. And like I said, I found it really fascinating finding and researching a lot about him and what he's done. I hope you've got something out of it and found it as interesting as I did. And look into the history of some of our other golf courses and maybe some of the ones that I mentioned, some of the ones you might have played, and just think a little bit more about them. Think about how long they've been around for and how much they have probably changed since their inception. Look at the landscape, look at the vegetation, look at all that and see what you think has been altered and for better or worse in your own opinion, in your own mind. I'm curious to know what you think about when you go out there in those courses and ones that you might already know and what you think about. So, like I said, hope you got something out of it. Always trying to keep you up to date with Walking the Fairways. Thank you again for listening. Please share it around. Tell your friends, tell your family. Write a comment. Please review it on Apple Podcasts or whatever it is on Apple that where I release it onto as well. Really appreciate you taking the time out to listen again and look forward to bringing you some more news and some more insight next episode in a couple of weeks. Thanks, guys. And as always, I'm Steve Smith, the golfing greenkeeper. You hit them clean and we'll keep them green.